Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with an esteemed Lady Power panel. So I'm Shomi Saha. I lead the Washington, D.C. office for Premier. We are primarily known as a supply chain company, also very involved in tech enablement with about 4,000 hospitals, 300,000 non-acute providers. And I'll let my fellow co-panelists introduce themselves as well.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Jen Goldsack. I'm the founder and CEO of a 501c3 nonprofit, the Digital Medicine Society. Our mission is to advance the safe, effective, and equitable use of digital technologies, and yes, I did say equitable, to redefine healthcare and improve lives. I think the most important part about us is to know that we are tech enthusiasts, not tech determinists. We're not here to shoehorn digital technologies, including AI, into every nook and cranny of healthcare and then say, aren't we clever? We really think a lot more about how do we use these powerful new sets of tools in the toolbox to actually address some of the most pressing and persistent challenges that we frankly have not been able to move the needle on in our industry for decades.
Hi, I'm Randy Siegel. I'm a healthcare regulatory and compliance attorney at Manat, Phelps & Phillips. I co-lead our digital health tech vertical, and have been working and following the patchwork of state and federal activity around AI governance and working with clients to sort of implement AI governance structure, negotiate contracts, both on the health system side as well as on the emerging company and technology side.
Awesome. Well, good afternoon. Gigi Yun. I am with Cohere Health. I think I am the only technologist on the panel. Been doing healthcare AI for 20 years, and Cohere Health focuses on solving the friction between provider and payer, a lot of administrative burden, and we take the pain out of the process. So.
All right, so we get to talk about hallucinations. It's a word that's been mentioned by almost every other panel today, and we get to dive into what it actually means. Now, one of the hardest parts about the intersection of healthcare and tech is actually distilling what is it that we're talking about. So I'm going to ask everyone, in 10 words or less, how would you describe what an AI hallucination is to a kindergartner, a mother, or in my world, a member of Congress? So I refer to AI hallucinations as when AI uses its imagination, and it matters because in healthcare, it can sometimes hurt patients. So how would you describe it, Jennifer?
I'm not sure I'd pick this particular description for a kindergartner, but I think it's the tech equivalent of bullshit.
I say it's when they make something up, but it sounds like it's a fact, so you don't want to question it.
I think the opposite of hallucination is when the AI is not grounded, it's not humble.
Okay. So in all of those descriptors, we're talking about technology. But let's talk about tech versus human for a second. Do physicians and other healthcare providers, do they have those same attributes about them? Do providers sometimes bullshit or use their imagination or say things with confidence that perhaps they shouldn't?
I'll give an example. So one of the things that we know to be true is that diffusion of innovation in healthcare takes 10 to 15 years. We know that across parts of the United States and indeed across parts of the world, women with early stage breast cancer, for example, are still being exposed to radical bilateral mastectomies, which in my opinion is pretty much akin to assault and battery, knowing that a lumpectomy and localized treatment will give you just as good outcomes without any of the issues that come with. And I don't think that's because there's a single individual who goes into not only the practice of medicine, but oncology in particular, who ever seeks to be a bullshit artist or to do harm. But I do think that it is challenging to wrap our arms around the enormous corpus of clinical scientific literature. What's the best treatment pathway? You know, how do we do that? How do you break out of what you've been prescribing? The human condition. I have cared for women like this for the last 30 or 40 years. Have I been wrong all that time? No, I haven't. I've seen these women going on to have families. You anchor to all of that. And so I think there's a corollary, if not a perfect sort of analogy, when the sort of human condition and the fact that we can't, like our sort of AI counterparts, absorb and keep on top of all of this information, and we have that bias of experience, can drive us towards making a recommendation that sounds very true, that sounds confident, that the person making the recommendation would argue is evidence-based, that actually is not.
Gigi, your organization has done some interesting research around error rates between AI and humans. Can you speak a little bit about what you found?
It's interesting. So those of us been in healthcare for a while are used to the notion of concordance, right? No one's perfect. We all have the best intention. But when you ask the same question to two clinicians, you often don't get the same answer, right? That's the notion of discordance. Typically anywhere from 5 to 30% depending on subject area for the same patient, same case, and in our scenario, for the same prior auth request. We spend a lot of energy training our clinicians to look at the cases, and we typically see 10 to 15% discordance rate. So we did the same benchmarking exercise with our AI tech. We're seeing single digit, 2 to 3%. So the question comes about to say, hey, if a human may disagree with a human about 10% at a time, but the machine may disagree with a human only 2% at a time, it could actually become an ethical question to not enable this technology.
And I think we were talking about it's not only potentially an ethical question, but it could create a new standard of care, a liability question. So there's concerns, obviously, if you use artificial intelligence and you rely on it and you get something wrong, that could be malpractice, just like in any other instance of potential malpractice, for maybe being negligent and not sort of, imposing your human judgment on top of the artificial intelligence algorithm. On the flip side, if we start to have AI that is augmenting physician decision-making that is 98% accurate, and your organization, whether you're a health system or a provider, is choosing not to deploy the technology out of fear of that 2% hallucination or some of the other risk factors related to AI, and you are missing diagnosis potentially, we could see a shift in sort of the expectation around the standard of care, such that we could see malpractice liability arising because you are opting not to use a technology that is considered the standard of care or enhancing diagnostic capabilities. I don't think that's going to happen immediately, and that would sort of play out throughout sort of case law. But it is something that I find super interesting, because at a certain point when it's being deployed, and in assuming that it is effective and the error rates sort of remain small in certain types of tests, that we're going to see a shift in the standard of care, and it's the expectation that you are augmenting clinical decision making with artificial intelligence.
So let's talk a little bit more about this liability component and the deployment of AI. And I often wonder if the deployment of AI is really any different than the deployment of tech that we've seen over the years in the practice of medicine. I'm a pharmacist by way of background, and I remember the day when we got drug-drug interaction checking technology it's part of the dispensing process, and so many questions were raised as to what if it missed a drug-drug interaction and I as a pharmacist continued to let a prescription go out the door. And there's the human in the loop conversation that we need to have as part of this liability, but how and why is the liability conversation around the employment of AI different than the deployment of any tech in medicine? Robots in surgical centers, for example. Why is it different?
So I think one of the challenges that we have, because AI is such a powerful technology, is that we conflate a few things. So let me try and pull a few things apart, and then I'm curious for you to pull those apart further. So let's take the example of, moving to laparoscopic sort of surgery. And we know that whether it's, a simple hernia repair, or whether it's a knee arthroscopy, or whatever this, looks like, or a knee replacement, right? That if we can do minimally invasive, then your recovery times are going to be shorter, that you have a lower rate of infection. In many cases, you have a better outcome. But not everyone can access, right, sort of laparoscopic surgery. Where we did see this, it required enormous investments from health systems, enormous investments. They had to buy the Da Vinci machine, they had to completely retool the OR, they had to train their sort of surgical teams, they had to come up with completely different rehabilitation protocols as a result. And still to this day, not everyone has access, but we're not looking to go and sue a rural, orthopedic surgeon in, the middle of the country because they're still doing open procedures, right? So that's an interesting tension. I think the other piece is somehow one of the questions that we ask at Dime often is what's the same and what's different between this powerful piece of digital technology and what we're used to working with. And I was a co-author on a paper that we put out by the National Academies of Medicine. And one of the things that I sort of really drove us towards was let's actually put a RACI into this. So a table of all the different stakeholders, who's responsible, accountable, who needs to be consulted and who needs to be informed. And when you actually look at traditional medical products, whether that's everything from sort of a tongue depressor to a CT scan, or whether it's a sort of novel molecule, right? You're a pharmacist. I mean, how many times are you thinking, oh my goodness, what country was this manufactured in? I need to go back and look at all the safety specs of the lab. There's a label. It says when it can be used, when it can't. And as long as you're prescribing along those lines and your clinical colleagues are looking at the sort of practice guidelines, then we feel comfortable. Why do we think that the liability issue or the responsibility for claims and labels and context of use should be shifted and should be different when we think about AI? Why should a physician or a pharmacist have to worry about those things when we don't for normal molecules? I'm not saying that it should be identical, but we seem to have moved away from starting with the scientific, regulatory, and theoretical framework that served us really well for decades when it comes to this particular set of technologies.
So if you pull that a little further and you think about maybe AI in the future having appropriate use case associated with it. This is how it was tested. This is how it was intended to be used. And I don't want to necessarily liken it to on-label versus off-label use. But would a framework like that potentially help with some of these liability questions? Randy, my fellow lawyer.
I think potentially. I mean, I think there is sort of this idea that we'll develop a model card or a nutrition label, I think is, some of the use cases, some of the language being used where it's going to say this is how it's tested and this is how it should be deployed and this is the risks and benefits. And then, I think that will help mitigate liability on both sides, both from the developer in terms of I'm telling you the parameters in which to use this AI technology, and on the deployer side, who says I'm using it within the parameters of this technology, within the label. I think part of it is just that it's novel and it changes over time, and there's a fear that it may drift, and unless you're a technologist or you're monitoring it all the time, you may not pick up on sort of the variations, which is a little bit different potentially than looking at a drug and saying, okay, it hasn't expired, I know that it is still intact and can be used, is that it's evolving. I also think that organizations just haven't yet gotten their heads around, it's really hard to monitor and audit artificial intelligence deployment when you're auditing and monitoring quality and safety and medical charts, and to add this on and maybe not have the expertise. So I also think there's a fear just about the ability to take on something new. And just to pull on something else you said is that this is operating outside of a regulatory framework. So it fits into some, and we're seeing some emerging patchwork of laws at the state level, and there's a few federal use cases where it's being regulated. But it's a little bit of a Wild West where there is no true accountability to some federal or state oversight body yet. That has really set the standard for what at least must be the minimum, the minimum controls that must be in place.
So absent a legislative or regulatory framework, we're often subject to health systems, providers, the end user, implementing some level of AI governance themselves. So Gigi, I'm really interested because we heard a lot today about how those that are being approached by vendors to purchase or invest in AI technologies are contemplating the pitches. Do you, as a vendor, ever actually sit back and evaluate the AI governance structures that the payers or the providers that you are looking to partner with have in place? And do you ever walk away from someone because they don't have an appropriate AI governance structure in place?
Interesting question. I have not personally experienced it yet, but my colleagues have. I think going back to your point, a part of the fear of AI is the uncertainty, right? Because when you take a drug or when you do a procedure, you know what goes in, what comes out. For AI, regardless how explicit the model labels are or the nutritional labels are, it's tough to actually understand how it may function in real life. So the way I think about it is, I would like to think of when you adopt an AI type technology, it's less of buying a new tool, it's as if you're hiring a new personnel in your team. Mm-hmm. So what are your HR criteria, which is equivalent to an AI governance protocol? What is your HR criteria when you bring in a new team member, right? How do you interview them? How do you train them? How do you monitor them? How do you evaluate the performances? So if you start thinking about agent as a team member, I think that helps us to get comfortable with, yes, right? A person have agency. Yes, the person learns over time. But how do we have faith in our team members? Same structure, and I think it goes back to the governance framework.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the workforce and how do we educate the workforce to identify what may or may not be a hallucination when they are leveraging AI in their day-to-day workflows. And then once we get through the providers, I definitely want to talk about the patient and the consumer angle of all of this as well. So how do we train our providers and educate them? Both those already existing in the workforce and then those that are still in training and being educated.
I mean, I think they're going to have to find space in the curriculum, which is already very tight, to train med students and nursing students on, artificial intelligence and understanding it and understanding how to ask questions, how to read, some sort of explanation that shows up that explains how the model's working, in order for them to be trained on it. It certainly isn't going to be sufficient to click through a course in your annual training that you're spending 3 hours doing already, to tell you how to train on AI. In New Mexico, actually, this week, the Board of Nursing just introduced regulations that would require CLE or continuing nursing education credits around artificial intelligence. And so they're building it also into like a reinforced training program. But I think it has to be iterative and not just something that's taught one time and then part of some refresher course that you click through, during all the other annual trainings that are undertaken.
Your annual training example just kind of brought back nightmares, but I can almost imagine, how many of us take that annual corporate training on how to identify phishing in emails and don't click this, don't click that, right? Do you imagine it almost being like that one day where there's a little button in your email that you click to say, this is suspicious?
Actually, we build it in our software.
Tell us more.
So, part of what makes AI powerful is the learning loop, right? So I think engaging the user on a regular basis, prompting them with questions, like, does it smell fishy? Or is it complete? We didn't talk about complete versus incomplete, right? Which is part of hallucination. You can be truthful but incomplete, right? Asking those questions on a regular basis, to me, it's not great for the users, but it's also great for the technology to improve over time. So yes to the continuous education, but I think it's double yes to the ongoing interactions. Like you're working with children, right? You always ask, so tell me about it. Tell me more, right? I think it's that relationship that we have the provider to build with technology. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad you asked the question because I think we're actually glossing over the need to do training too much. And I think it's not just training, it's training and investing in sort of that part, but it's also, are we providing extra time? Are we providing extra reimbursement in order to do this, right? Are we actually truly supporting that decision? And one of the things I'm sort of starting to get a bit of an itch about is the human in the loop language, right? It's starting to give me that sort of visceral reaction I have when you hear sort of patient-centric banded about, oh, we're very patient-centric, really? What are you actually doing about it? And it's, tell me, if you're putting a human in the loop, are you giving them extra liability insurance? Are you giving them extra time between different visits, or are you extending visit time for them to be able, for clinicians to actually be able to look at this? Are you providing appropriate training? Are you thinking about the vendor solutions that you select and whether it's baked in, or are you building that into your own HR systems? One of the other things I think is interesting and important as well as we think about investing in the clinical workforce is, one, whatever the technology looks like today, if it keeps going at this pace of change, is going to be remarkably different in even a few more years. And I think if we teach in medical schools or nursing schools today to prepare clinicians for the technology and the workflows of today, it's going to be obsolete by the time that they're practicing. And we haven't actually had a conversation about steering for the curve ahead. Where do we actually think technologies are going to be in 3 to 5 years? What does that workflow look like? And what does the roles and responsibility of a clinician look like in that moment? We have to train for that. Otherwise, we're always going to be on the back foot. The other thing that I'm not sure if anyone caught, riveting document, or 1,800 pages of it, was the calendar year 2026 physician fee schedule, and they had some RFI questions in there, and one of them was around how are we actually going to reimburse for SaaS and for AI. And what makes me nervous is that we can and should build in reimbursement structures for today, but we risk driving a perverse incentive to continue to use huge amounts of clinical time evaluating the product, which should be a problem that we weed out over time, and we're never actually going to capture efficiencies. So we've got to be really smart.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk a little bit about hallucinations and, okay, so it's technology. It's not a drug or a device, but in the drug or device space, when there is an adverse event, those get reported to the FDA. The FDA then evaluates them. The FDA then has levers that they can pull, whether that's recalls, removing the product from the market, black box warnings, etc. Do you foresee a similar type of regulatory environment being put forward for AI and hallucinations? Or, we can't always just copy paste what exists into new. And so what are some of the nuances that we need to think through as we contemplate regulating this world?
So as of right now, there are not really frameworks in place. A few states have reporting requirements if there's a material sort of adverse event, for lack of a better word, a safety event resulting from AI, and it's not specific to healthcare. So there's these general large omnibus laws related to consequential decision making and use of AI, like the Colorado bill. Last night or this morning, because I'm not sure when the press release came out, the Joint Commission with CHI issued draft guidelines, and one of the more interesting and potentially controversial things that I think came out of that draft is that they are recommending voluntary reporting processes related to AI hallucination and AI events, whether it's to the Joint Commission, whether it's to a patient safety organization, or obviously through the FDA if it's a regulated device.
Right.
That has not really been talked about a lot in the domain, but I am certain that this document is going to drive a lot of conversation around whether there should be some mandatory reporting framework like there is for sort of adverse events in a hospital, and then defining what the level of event has to be for reporting will probably warrant a lot of debate.
Yeah.
Because obviously not every hallucination is material. And so what type of adverse event does it need to be, and who's actually going to own the reporting structure? Will that ultimately sit with the State Department of Health, the Board of Medicine? Will it be a voluntary organization? Will a PSO spin up that will, take a look at this? I think that's an open question, but it's a very timely question because I think it's about to become a very publicly debated topic.
Well, let's talk materiality for a second, because not every hallucination can potentially carry the same level of harm, depending upon how that AI is being deployed. If it's an administrative task, maybe not as much of an issue if there's an hallucination versus if you're looking at diagnosis or treatment. So how do you differentiate how to prioritize the time and effort that you were taking to address those hallucinations. Gigi?
That's a loaded question. Like, at least in the space that I operate in, when you're talking about prior auth, you could be making a decision for someone's surgical event, or you putting a device in somebody's body, as opposed to a diagnostic imaging. They're in two different ends of the risk spectrum. So far to date, it's a lot of self-regulation, self-governance. So in Cohere Health, we actually put them in 5 specific buckets. So we have a committee with the clinicians, with our clients, with our own technologists to determine if that is same use case, but depending on the clinical area, there's different risk levels and risk tolerance that we're willing to take. And then depending on that, the alerting system will be different. In the lower end of the risk, it has to hit a certain threshold for someone to get alerted. But for the high end of risk, we actually have circuit breaker. So what I mean by circuit breaker is AI actually stop at that instant and alert, like red alert come out for the user and the supervisor. So it really depends, yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about the patient, the consumer, right? We talk about consumer-centric medicine so much. The consumer is so engaged in their healthcare. Dr. Google's been around for a while. So as we think about how AI is being deployed with the patient being the end user, how do hallucinations come into play? And so much of DC right now is fear-mongering around the potential of hallucinations to impact the patient, the consumer. And that fear-mongering is almost driving the potential for regulatory frameworks versus the clinical benefit. And I think there's also this inherent fear that hallucinations may become the new disinformation or misinformation in healthcare. And so how do we connect the dots there and help educate the patient about what could or could not be a hallucination and how they need to identify these items, or when to raise their hand and ask questions?
So I go back to my very annoying question of what's the same and what's different. We've done nothing as a society to educate against mis and disinformation, and there's an argument that there are some people sitting in DC, at least I'd make it, they've lent into it, right? Why now we have a new set of tools perpetrating, can't think of a better word, mis and disinformation? Why would we expect society to act differently? We have a set of values as a society. We have turned a blind eye to mis and disinformation, whether it's in healthcare or whether it's in other areas. Can AI do it too? Can it do it at a greater scale? Arguably, yes. But as a society, we actually haven't shown that we care. And I think that maybe a new set of technologies is going to drive a conversation for us as a society where we have to grapple with it, or maybe we will continue to not care because more educated individuals, more technically literate individuals are going to be fine. And we know where we place our values as a society. So I think that's one part of it. I think the second part of it goes back to, I love the different kinds of sort of risk categories that you'd sort of articulated, but medical decision making has always been defined by risk-benefit sort of trade-offs. And I think what sometimes we don't think about enough is risk in the context of benefit, right? How do we actually think about risk when the alternative is not what your trusted primary care physician would say, who you've had a wonderful relationship with for the last 15 years, but the absence of access to care? How do we think about those sorts of trade-offs? And it goes back to, I think, your statement, which is this becomes like a sort of ethical question that we have to grapple with as society. And you use the language sort of interchangeably, consumer, patient, but the majority of tools that we as individuals are using are not labeled. I was about to say touted, and like in some cases they are, but sort of labeled as a patient-facing product. And I think that becomes slippery as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there's a difference between a patient use that's facilitated by a provider or a health system that's sort of augmenting or intended to be utilized by that patient, and sort of the I think you still have the same level of oversight or governance that you would have if you were sort of using it for an internal purpose. It's very different than a consumer-facing product, which is a bit of the wild, wild west, and in absence of a regulatory framework at the federal level or the state level is really leaving it to self-governance. And so I don't know how you, how you educate the consumer. A lot of states are trying to put labels on things to say, generated by AI, or AI might not always be accurate. Obviously, those are going to get pushback if they say things like AI might not always be accurate, because same with the human. But I don't know how we solve that problem, and I don't know that it's a new problem.
Yeah. So let me ask you this: you often hear the lingo around how AI algorithms, garbage in equals garbage out. The algorithm's only as good as the data and the comprehensiveness of what it is trained on. Just like any clinician, right? So much of their education experience dictates their success as a clinician. How much of a hallucination is a hallucination or a poorly trained algorithm?
Depends.
I got ooh, that was exciting.
Depends. That is interesting. So I think it goes back to having clarity on what this particular widget is intended to do. If it's intended to operate, let's make an analogy, right? When you're driving a Honda Civic versus a Jeep, you have different expectation of its performances. So I think we just need to be very clear on this is the data domain that particular engine or AI intends to do. So if you operate within that domain, then in my opinion, the technology provider needs to give you a guarantee on the data premises that you should be successful around. But you brought up a really good point. Just like this morning, I got a call because we had a circuit breaker situation. And the interesting thing is we actually conflated AI hallucination with bad handwriting. So we detected with both large language model as a judge and a human in the loop that the AI was making things up. But then through investigation, it turned out AI did not make anything up. It's just that the handwriting of the prescription was illegible.
That's why you need a pharmacist in the loop, because we can read anything.
So actually, it's going to be a really interesting conversation tomorrow. How do we classify a situation like that? It goes back to the data quality. Yeah.
Well, let me also ask you this. There's an obvious notion that hallucinations are bad. Can the opposite ever be true? That hallucinations may not be always terrible? And I'm thinking through it from a couple different perspectives, right? Does a hallucination help us identify a potential gap in the data or a gap in the research where we need to go do more? You think about innovation in medicine and technology, a lot of this started from a crazy idea, which some people may say was a hallucination when you think of who invented it, and then it proved itself out. So are hallucinations always bad?
I think hallucination is always bad when you don't know that it is hallucinating. Like, I will be completely happy to have a brainstorming conversation with my AI chatbot if it's willing to share with me how confident they are with what they say. That will be where I am. Yeah.
The analogy that I can think of is if we think about clinical trials data, and I think that we sort of across the board think that missing data is always a problem. But actually, as we've become more curious about missing data over the last decade or so, we've actually started to learn that in certain situations, missing data is actually telling us something, right? If we're looking at sort of data completeness when we're doing clinical trials in mental health, for example, or in pain, actually when we start to see data missingness, that's usually a signal that someone's doing really well, because they're living their life and they're not sort of doggedly recording sort of daily in their PRO. And instead we ascribe sort of blamey language like, oh, poor compliance and adherence and this, that, and the other. Whereas actually the missing data is telling us something if we pause for a second and reflect on it. So I think this allows me to make a point that I want to make, which is I think we put an awful lot of value judgments onto the technology, where technology by definition doesn't have a set of values, right? It's how we interact with them, how curious we are. If we're looking for hypothesis generation, where we do experience hallucinations, like that's up to us. That's how we as humans interact with the system, find value in the system, look to improve them, because frankly, if we can't make these tools work for us, it's unclear to me how we actually have a sustainable healthcare system into the future. So I think we have a responsibility to be curious and to be sort of on the lookout for these sorts of things and thinking about how we actually compare and contrast with other sort of legal frameworks, at least as a jumping off point.
So last question, let's say we are sitting on the same stage a year from now. What do you hope changes as part of the conversation a year from now as it relates to AI and hallucinations?
I hope that we're talking about it more in a risk framework, like not just on the stage, but from a national and a state and a regulatory and a liability perspective, that we're differentiating between hallucinations that matter and those that don't in a larger conversation and context of not all AI use cases are the same and need to be regulated and debated and have the same governance process. And that we're really calibrating how we're thinking about it to the actual risk to the various stakeholders.
From a technology standpoint, I would love us to have an explicit conversation on the incentives. What incentives are we giving the AI or the vendor? There are use cases that we want it to be more creative, and there's use cases we don't. And so far, at least the generic models out there are typically rewarded simply based on, give me the next word. It's very awkward when there's silence, right? So I would love to have a conversation about how do we create the right incentive structure for the technology to get to the right accuracy level depending on a use case.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jennifer?
And just to build on those 2 points, I think that we have, the courage, without using a stick to beat our clinical colleagues who do extraordinary work under pressure every single day, to be able to ask the question, compared to what? What's the risk of this compared to what? You spoke about the different contexts, but I think we need to get a little bit real about the crisis that our healthcare system finds itself in. And absent the use of this tool, or absent the risk of this hallucination, what's the not standard of care, what's the actual alternative, and be comfortable having those conversations publicly.
Love it. Thank you, ladies, so much for joining us today. Please give the panelists a wonderful round of applause.